And we have seen this happen in Ghana so many times, particularly when it's come to projects that are targeting youth unemployment, that you put in place politicians in charge of these institutions whose only primary consideration and concern is how much can I steal, how much can I put my own family and constituents there. And it's not a professionalized aspect of how governance is contemplated or thought about.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on today's edition of Unpopular Opinion. We are very excited to have Mr. Osajifa with us in our virtual studio today. We are going to be discussing various issues regarding his work he's doing in Ghana, especially in the area of advocacy and social justice for the poor and the marginalized people across Ghana. I'd like to welcome you, Mr. Osajifa, to the Unpopular Opinion. And it is really an honor for us to have you today to share your thoughts with us, with the audience, based upon the work you've done in Ghana over the years. Having said that, it is important that the audience get to know who is Mr. Osajifor. Could you share a bit about your background, what you've done over the years, your experiences, and what actually inspired you to continue doing the work you are doing in social justice and advocacy in Ghana?
There's nothing more difficult I find than when one is invited to self-introduce or to talk about oneself. I mean, I think generally I like to think myself as an active citizen in Ghana who is interested in social justice. I work primarily full time as a lawyer, and a lot of my work advances my own politics, which is to see a fairer general society, and that's kind of what I do in Ghana and speak about and mobilize generally. But I consider myself as a community mobilizer, somebody who's interested in bringing everyday people together in order to ensure that society does right by us and by everyone. I think that's generally what I consider myself to be.
All right. Thank you very much for that introduction. You are one of the co-founder of the movement for Fix the Country. I'd like to understand what were some of the specific objectives that your organization was advocating for, and what are some of the achievements, or were you able to make some achievement in this process?
I mean, I think that, Fix the Country itself, like many social movements now, is uncharacteristic in that it is not one of the typical civil society actors where a group of individuals get together, believing themselves to have defined for themselves particular objectives and say that this is the vision we want to realize for Ghanaian or whatever society in which they come up in. Uh, for Face the Country itself, most of us became accidental activists. We're individuals from different walks of life who, in the best of a moment, became interested in the ways in which we can push government. The conversations, like for instance, when you think about NSAS happening in Nigeria, a lot of this hashtag sprung movement come off mainly in the spur of the moment. For me, in particular, I can only speak to my own motivations in becoming interested in mobilizing a lot of young people around the hashtag. Let's say I was looking for something that would give me a reason to believe again, a reason to think that young Ghanaians were interested in their democracy. Young Ghanaians were interested in ways in which they can participate in the political process other than through competitive and active partisan politics. That's kind of where the idea comes from. And I think that for most of us, it became a vehicle through which we wanted to mobilize. We wanted to be able to influence ideas and politics in a particular way. And in that regard, I think that we've been hugely successful. I think that we haven't seen an example of a young people's movement that has sprung, which is unconnected to some of the main power blocks or political forces in our society, which is mobilizing the dedicated middle, right? And by that I mean folks who haven't found a traditional home in any of the political parties, generally in Ghana, folks who are disinterested in partisan politics and who are more convinced that perhaps the way forward for a society like ours is a non-partisan approach to mobilizing. That is, I think, Face the Country provided an avenue and a voice for. For us now, we become interested, I think, in how we can continue to consolidate that base of young people who are interested in engaging with the political process. And that has become the raison d'etre of what all of this is about. That the true and sincere belief that if young people can find ways in which they can interact, they can be able to self-educate together, they might be able to then find ways of growing and also perhaps better influencing our politics. And that continues to be our mission and objective, I think, in many ways.
Today's video is proudly sponsored by Magnite Clothing Brand. If you are living in Europe or in America or in any part of the world and you need an African clothing, you can simply check them on their Instagram page. The link is in the description of this video. Mr. Osajifor, thank you very much for that explanation. I'd like to draw your attention to your arrest in February 2024 for making a social media comment, and you were charged with a serious crime of felony. So can you walk us through that experience and how has that influenced your activism activity or your activism mindset over the years? I mean, since that time.
Yeah, in February 2022, I got arrested for the first time, I think, in my young and professional life, I think. And to be honest, for myself in particular, the risk of arrest has always been on the horizon, I think, because I think that we've built societies and our governments are very intolerant of dissent across the continent. And so it wasn't particularly surprising that that happened. What was surprising was the basis for the arrest, and also the fact that I was charged with treason felony. Treason in itself is a political trial. It's a political offense. It's a view. It comes from a political viewpoint rather than anything else. And so, in many ways, I understood the politics of what was at stake. But it's also a big thing in that I think it's communicating of the government's intention to be able to isolate voices like my own, to be able to stigmatize voices like our own, that we are not interested necessarily in the public good, that we are folks who are looking to destroy what is the public good. But in many ways and invariably, it is that certain individuals are speaking against a particular power structure of an elite system. And in that, in charging me with treason felony, I think that they're absolutely correct because they understood that what we were saying was threatening to a certain kind of elite consensus of politics that existed, that we were looking to break that consensus is status quo in many ways. So of course, it's a cynical charge, but it also exposed my and expanded in many ways my own horizon and perspective on activism. That the times I spent in jail also be able to allow me to form community and solidarize and build movements with persons who were in jail. In prison populations are particular populations that are very receptive to the demand for social change because they view the society from its worst point, the West who receive the West in terms of how society treats any other humans. And so, yeah, it allowed me to be able to grow in connecting the dots in terms of how different struggles must interconnect and must actively be in the pursuit of the intersectional nature of our movement and how we're able to create community beyond ourselves, I would say. But I think finally as well, you could say that the intent and purpose of a charge like that is also to be able to quiet dissenting voices, to be able to create a fear factor for young activists in particular, who then come to understand that the stakes are high and that the fear of death haunts you if you speak against or demand for societal change. And in that, I think the government or the state or the regime was very successful in weaponizing the fears of the average citizen and creating a sense that, you could ultimately be killed in the cause of your advocacy. And so that made the stakes very real for me. And for somebody like myself, it only amplified my desire to see change because I understood then clearly that this was working, that the political class was afraid. The political class became concerned for our activism, and that is exactly where we want them to be. Afraid that the people can return and take away the mandate from them. Afraid that they ought to do right by the people, or else that this is not something that the people will take misgovernance for granted any longer. And so, in many ways, it teaches one so much. I think.
Thank you very much. I'd like to encourage each and every one of you that are listening to us to please be a supporter of this channel by liking, commenting, sharing, as well as recommending individuals to us that are doing remarkable work in their various countries, in youth development, in advocacy, in political participation, in entrepreneurship. We are going to try our best to bring them to this platform to discuss the critical roles that they are playing in their various countries. Mr. Osajifor, I want us to talk about something you always say something, we are not governed, we are extorted. So I want you to please talk about that statement. Why do you think that is the case in Ghana?
Well, it's a social reality of I think it's the social reality of the African across the continent, actually. We have our leaders have a parasitic relationship with us, and we become the vehicles for them to ascend to power. And in that regard, once ascended to power, they don't understand the people's mandate as a responsibility or a mandate to improve their lives or create better avenues for liberty and freedom, and to expand the frontiers of human imagination and human capacity and what we can do as individuals in the short and limited time we have on earth. Instead, the mandate then becomes a weapon quickly weaponized against us. They control all forces of the society. They control the police force. They control the power to tax, the power to use legitimate violence. And in quickly, we kind of realize that we are then held hostage by a criminal elite that is more interested in self-preservation and preserving the access to power, and also in particular in the societies where the distribution of public goods and access to welfare it's so limited, or there's really no clear path to that. It becomes an avenue for people to create a clientele system. You support me and you praise me, and then you get access to money and wealth and economic opportunity. You speak against me and my way of going, and then I must make sure that you are excluded from all access to proper economic life. The essence of government and the essence of why we give other people the mandate is that collectivizing our individual efforts allows for people to better achieve social justice, to be able to achieve individual liberty. Unfortunately, it hasn't been the reality. And for many times, we would question democracy for what democracy pretends to do and say that it has not been able to take us out of poverty, you would say. And then on the other hand, we would then put in place military regimes and we quickly realize that no, those people also are actually not there for the public good. And so we're caught in a perpetual state of experimentation there's a consistent class that find themselves well treated at our expense or being able to take hold of the public purse and do with it as they please. That is the tragedy of the African. And how we revolve that, how we ask ourselves grand questions. How can power ensure that we solve poverty in our lifetime? How can power ensure that we find individual liberty? That we are not constrained in everyday life by social malady is a problem. One of the examples I give is that, listen, if you take, for us in Africa, the common diseases like malaria are one of the biggest killers on the continent. And yet our leaderships have not been able to incentivize and create a framework for which science would be able to solve those problems for us, to free us from sickness. That is a tragedy in many respects, if you ask me. So those are the things that I think about in terms of what is the power ought to do for us and what's its relationship with us on a day-to-day basis.
If you want to see this podcast going very far, if you want us to continue to have quality guests every week on this podcast, I want you to please subscribe to this channel, like, comment, share, as well as recommend individuals to us that are doing remarkable works in their various countries. We will try our best to bring them to this platform. Having said that, Mr. Osajifo, you are quoted for saying thirsty for coup of the mind. What do you mean by that? And how do you think this will lead to transformative change in societal behavior in Ghana?
There's nothing more depressing, I think, than an enslaved mind. A mind that is deprived of the means of self-reflection, a mind that is critical and analytical, a mind that has doubt. Because there's nothing more destructive than certainty. We must always live in doubt, in doubt of our ideas, in doubt of the systems that surround us, in doubt of what is promised and given to us as justice. We must question those. And if we are deprived of the means and ability to be able to question, um, we then lose the capacity to reform. And that is where it must begin with. In the liberation of the African person must come from his thought processes, his ability to think through and reason, his ability to question his reality and what he has accepted as normal or what he has normalized. And without, poking fun or doubting the normal and what is normalized, what is presented to you as the default of the African, that this is what you would become. This is the height of what you can achieve unless there's an unsettling of the mind, and this is what I talk about the coup, of the mindsets we have, we will not be able to seek and pursue progress. Because at every point in time, we are then content. And contentment is the enemy of progress. We must be disturbed in our minds and in our soul to seek better and to seek different. That I think is the vehicle for true reform and true justice.
You are highly noted for being an outspoken person, and you say a lot of things that spark controversy in Ghana. And how do you handle criticism in this regard, especially from those who misinterpret your intention and your standpoint when it comes to critical national issues?
I think that um, anybody who speaks up publicly must accept, as a consequence of their speech, the speech is quickly stigmatized. Speech clarifies and also confuses, but also speech is threatening. And then I intend my speech to threaten the status quo, the ordinary way of doing things. And so I don't necessarily think that I am misunderstood. I think that I am understood clearly, um, in many respects, anyway, but that my speech threatens. It threatens a particular way of life. It threatens a particular consensus. So I am under no illusion to believe that, oh, if only everybody would understand me clearly, then they would understand that I am for the public good and for which reason all is fine. No, there are persons whose livelihoods is against the public good. And there are people who have made it an industry to mislead the public as to what it is good and what is in their benefit. And so for which reason, my speech would and must attract criticism. It must attract dissent and disagreement. It must trouble people's minds. And even for those who are certain that they believe and understand me, they must question me. They must critique those ideas rather than the person. And they must do so in the belief that it improves the thought process and our pursuit of justice. So I am somebody who believes in the power of dissent and to have dissenting opinions, and necessarily in this process do not expect that my ideas and my philosophy on life should then be seen as beyond questioning, or that persons must swallow them hook and sinker. In that process, I lose the benefit of refining my own thoughts, because my thoughts must be challenged for me then to become convinced of why they are a better idea than others. So I am inviting of those critique and dissent, but I'm also very mindful, like, there are people who do not desire the public good and desire don't are not interested in the public interest, that would want to stigmatize my voice, that would want my death, for instance, with charging me with treason. So that is the reality of what one must wake up to. And I'm very much aware of that reality. And I'm not, I don't create any illusions for myself that because I am speaking truth to power, or I'm saying what is in the public good, necessarily means that the public would be on my side, or that power forces in the society would look at me and say, let him be, he is fine. No, remember that Christ only preached goodness and forgiveness. And in fact, on top of that, he was able to feed 5,000 people with some loaves of bread and two fishes. And even that, people deemed him material for crucifixion. I have never given anybody, I've never fed 5,000 with two fishes. And so I cannot expect to be better treated. So we must accept that as our reality of our advocacy. But that is not an invitation for us to stop. It's an invitation to continue to react to those critics and to be able to push back on those ideas and refine our own ability to influence and to reach the people who ought to be reached.
I want us to go into another side of the discussion that has to do with political participation. I'd like to understand, are you a member of a political party, or have you ever considered joining any political party to effect change within the political structure in Ghana? If not, do you think activism is the right way to effect change out of the political structure in Ghana?
My reaction to this is multifold. First of all, one of the things, and I've heard this so many times being suggested to me, that perhaps the best way in which we can create echo for the message and what we are trying to achieve is to become a political party and to be able to join the competitive race for political power. And one of the things that I say is that when you look at the Ghana electoral roll, we have over 10 political parties that exist in the space. If political parties solved the problems of the country, we wouldn't have the problem as they are. There has to be more than a vehicle. Political parties, after all, vehicles for political contestation of power. But there's a way in which we can influence people. I think that one's ideas can be influential necessarily without contesting for power. And I think that it is only an egoistical project that tells you that I cannot make a social impact. I cannot achieve change. I cannot be able to drive conversation and influence society unless you give me power. You ought to be afraid of those individuals. I sincerely believe that power, there are different forms of power. The power that that you can get through the electoral mandate. There's power that you can get through influencing ideas, people, and institutions. And we must be able to harness every form of power that is available to us to be able to achieve change. Now, as to whether or not that looks at competing for political office, I have said clearly that I am not at a point where I am convinced that is the path and journey for me. But that's not to say that if somebody else is convinced that is the path for them, that I should dissuade them. There's not a one approach to be able to achieve social justice. And if that's the way forward, and some people believe in that, then sure, they can go ahead and do that. And then there are people within political parties already that listen to me and become convinced of the dire urgency of change. Then sure, they should go ahead and change that. It cannot be expected that I, as an individual, must preach the message and also do the fasting at the same time, or I must necessarily do everything within the value change of social change for it to be authentic. No, I don't believe that. Am I a member of any political party? I don't necessarily believe is the vehicle for change, and so I'm not in there now. I think one of the ways in which my advocacy has tried to reinforce is to create this idea that change can be achieved whether within or without the party structures, perhaps more effectively without those party structures. So many times I've heard people say that, oh, they are in situations where if only they had more, or that they are in power, and say that, well, you who don't have more power are freer in thought and action than I am. Clearly, that's telling me something. If the person who has been given power believes that I, who has now none of those power, is freer in my actions and in my thoughts, then surely I also have to accept and believe that in some regard. But yeah, but I don't stop people. I don't think that people who listen to me and become convinced that political power is the way to go. Sure, they do so, but they must do so in the reality that forces outside parliament or forces outside power are also crucial to social change. And those forces must also be preserved. We mustn't only recruit and deplete the space of civic actors and people who can hold government accountable for them to join government as the only way in which we can achieve social justice.
This video is proudly sponsored by Magnite Clothing Brand. If you are living in Europe or in America or in any part of the world and you need an African clothing, you can simply check them up on their Instagram page. Their link is in the description of this video. I want us to talk about the economic aspect of the Ghanaian economy. Uh, in the past, the Ghanaian economy was doing pretty well, but in recent years, there have been some serious challenges in the Ghanaian economy. And there is also an hike increase in youth unemployment. So I'd like to understand from your perspective, what do you think are some of the structural changes that needs to be made in order for the Ghanaian people to be able to have an equitable society? And what are some of the mechanisms that you think the new government, need to put in place so that we will see an increase in youth employment that will be able to result into better or quality of living for the people of Ghana?
One of the things that we have continuously championed, and I'm very convinced about, is the need for Ghanaian society to undergo a constitutional moment, a moment where we put a constitution on the chopping blocks and reflect about its role in the social mess in which we find ourselves. Creating an equitable and just society is what we intend and seek to achieve. In what ways does the current constitutional enabling document allow that framework to 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 come to effect or come into fruition? I don't think it is. I think that we have to be able to reflect on, well, in the context of a constitutional document, to think, contemplate amendments or reform or change that elevates the project of social justice and equitable development or equitable opportunities. Because clearly the current framework has not been able to achieve or deliver that to us. And we must continue to think around all of this to be able to achieve that. But also, I think that, we have created societies and a political system which is like a leaking bucket. You're trying to go to the riverside and fetch water and bring home with a basket with holes. For which reason, the only process is that the only person who gets any bath is the one carrying the water. And you have to think about the public space and access to social goods as fetching water from a bucket. That those we put in charge will surely get wet on the way home because the water is constantly dripping on them. But it never gets to the people. And by this, one of the most, ways in which we punch holes in the bucket to carry the water is through a couple, allowing corruption to fester. That it is fine that people can jump the queue and be able to get and dip their hands into the public purse at the expense of those who are waiting in the line for school, those who are waiting in the line for proper hospitals. Individuals can tap onto that and walk away with. And that's a concern. That's something that we have to be able to deal with. One of the obstacles as well to creating a society in which every young person can be able to find for themselves access to an equitable livelihood also comes from the very nature of those who are supposed to make the distribution, the politics. and those who are in charge of the distribution of public goods, who then, take it upon themselves and own and treat the public space and the public resources as if it was their own. Those get in the way of being able to build a project that ensures the economic emancipation of young people in various societies, including the Ghanaian society. If people have to believe that you have to go up and line up in front of a minister's house, you have to be able to send a message and beg a minister when your child needs to go to school, a member of parliament, for them to be able to get access to education. That is a problem. People were doing that, and by result of it, what exists to be able to serve a broader society completely disappears and withholds away. We can get fanciful in talking about, well, if only the government sponsored more agriculture across board and more young people go into farming, or more people got into engineering through factories the state has built or private citizens have been able to put together. You cannot plant a seed on concrete. If the soil is not fertile, if the political environment is not fertile to be able to nurture and ensure that kind of good, then you're not going to get it. If there's going to be a lot of false starts and ends, and we've seen this happen in Ghana so many times, particularly when it's come to projects that are targeting youth unemployment, that you put in place politicians in charge of these institutions whose only primary consideration and concern is how much can I steal, how much can I put my own family and constituents there. And it's not a professionalized aspect of how governance is contemplated or thought about. We are always going to have that problem unless the nature of power and how power considers these things also begins to change.
Thank you very much for following us. If you reach this far, I'll encourage all of you to please be a supporter of this channel. If you want to see better guests coming on this podcast every week, if you want us to be in improved studio, if you want us to have better equipment in our studio, I want you to please subscribe to this channel. You can like, comment, share, recommending individuals to us. That will do us really well. Mr. Sajif, I want us to talk about social media. Uh, how do you think social media has been able to influence your advocacy in Ghana? And how do you believe it is a tool that young people should use to effect proper change in the democratic system in Ghana? Also, I also like to understand what are some of the main or what are some of the significant challenges that you experience on a day-to-day activity, and how do you navigate those challenges?
First of all, let's talk about the social media in Israel. You have to think about social media. I mean, I prefer the name alternative media, which is an ability to allow people to circumvent the traditional restrictions on speech and content production and what is fed to the people. And so you don't have to go and get and apply for a license to speak or to broadcast. You can reach people directly. I mean, some of the traditional restrictions on people's ability to mobilize, to be able to spread messaging, and to educate themselves reduces. And anytime we're able to push back on governmental control, the better for democracy. And so, for the first time, access has been open to individuals like myself and others who would not have had the opportunity to be able to acquire and build their own TV and radio stations, to be able to with a few clicks convey complex thoughts to people on different sides of the Atlantic or different parts of the world, who can immediately connect to what we are saying and create community around that. The ability to create community is the biggest path to reform, because you need freedom of assembly. You need to assemble. You can only assemble if there's a medium to communicate the venue of what you are to assemble, the issues on which you are assembling on. Unless those platforms exist, then you assemble, but you assemble in vain. So that's what I think social media has done for us, or anybody in particular in general. In terms of personal challenges, I think we ought to think more closely about what is the cost of speaking out, what is the cost of dissent, and how do we ensure that a lot more people are able to join and speak up. If we don't deal with the fact of how expensive it is and the personal and emotional cost of what it takes for people to speak up, to seek the better for their various countries and democracies, then we're not going to see that materialize. It's a big deal. I mean, yes, I've had my fair share of tribulations, but I avoid talking about them. I say that in many respects, I've found that people treat these things as activist porn. They like the porn, the feeling of oh wow, we went through all of this, and then they move on with their lives. And so that's level of rating like entertainment of giving people that I've kind of stopped doing. I do think though that the challenges that people face, ordinary people face in speaking out, are still too high. The cost of protecting democracy is still too high. And we must find a way as a society to reduce that cost to ensure that more and more people speak up. And that must come, unfortunately, to dedicated organizing and working the slippery slope. You're always in the danger of being mistreated, manhandled, arrested, and all the ways in which the state traditionally suppresses voices and dissent. You know.
You said something in your previous statement. That was about people going to politicians, ministers' house, asking them for to sponsor their children in schools and all of that. I think that's something that is happening almost all across West African countries. Because I'm originally from Liberia and I see that happening all of the times. And in Ghana, a lot of young people that I've interviewed on this podcast also say similar things like that. So I think this is something that is not just uh, uh, limited to Ghana, but it's also across the region. And I think that it's now time that the leadership of those various countries, especially we, the young people ourselves, need to take some leadership position. We need to take, when I say leadership position, I mean to stand out for things that are right. Because if you become a supporter of a corrupt system, you will, it actually benefits you. So you will not want to speak out, because if you do, whatever you are benefiting from the corrupt system, you won't be able to get those benefits, and that is a serious problem. And I also do believe that we need to avoid partisan politics, because partisan policies is one of the means that is destroying not just Ghana but all across the African continent or West African region. Because if we are not bent on, if we cannot unite ourselves based on national issues, national achievements, what we need to do, national goals, because every nation has a goal. We have 5 years, 10 years, long-term goals. If we cannot unite ourselves despite of our political differences and come up with, this is what the government has set as its national agenda, and we begin to hold government responsible for achieving those goals, I think that's the only way we can move forward. And having said that, I want us to look at Ghana's position on the international stage. Especially Ghana is rated highly when it comes to democracy in the world as an African country. And how do you think human rights governance are still a prevalent issue in Ghana? And how do you think those issues can be eradicated? As many countries around the world indicates that Ghana is doing really well when it comes to democracy, freedom of speech, human rights. But yet there are other things that the government, especially the previous government, was cracking down on dissenting voice. So how do you think this affects Ghana's position on the international stage? And what lessons Ghana can learn from other countries?
I'll make two comments. The first is that when we think about, the way in which a country is organized and what its reputation and constitutes its reputation, we come to understand quickly that most countries and every country runs on a certain myth. Whether true or not, those myths crystallize over time and become very difficult to shake off. So, for instance, a person may say Nigeria and what somebody thinks about is fraud and 419. Whether or not the vast majority of the state itself allowed a permissive environment for that is irrespective. It has gained a particular reputation and goes by it. In Ghana's case, Ghana has enjoyed the free PR of, the fact that its founding generation were active freedom fighters, persons who believed in the liberation of the continent, persons that made their voices carry weight in international and global affairs, and for which reason Ghana became some sort of a beacon for many countries and attracted a lot of goodwill for that, and by whether good or bad, by the end of 1992, uh, the country then went into a process where its last military ruler was in the country. But it's not the only country, and it's not the first country which had straightened up and ensured there was no military rule. There are countries which, like Senegal, has never experienced an overthrow of their democracy before. But for whatever reason, good or bad, I think that there was a need also for the foreign aid community and consensus to create a success story for all the money spent in Africa. There has to be a showing that this country is democratic. And by that, we count the fact that there's a political change from one government to the other, and not the substance of what makes a democracy. Nowhere else is democracy and the measure of life measured by how many times, who has changed hands or what. Certainly not in the West. It is about the quality of people's life. It's about the government's responses to everyday issue. It's about human rights abuses. All these things remain intact. And all you can have is that you throw over its elections across the face of it, then all the ills that are present in every other African country can be forgotten. So that's some of the challenge that we have to deal with. But the country's reputation is lived in the country itself. Ghana is the reality of Ghana. For me, it's my experience in Ghana and with Ghanaian authorities. That is the face of Ghana, not any propaganda or any PR or whatever that case may be. That view of Ghana is useful to the political elite because it allows them to be able to get away with a lot. People then do not consider them as at risk, and for which reason they can exert power and they can be able to use power in very oppressive ways, as we saw in the last regime do, and get away with it. Whereas other countries might not be able to get away with that level of crackdown on dissenting voices. How do we make sure, as a people, that that reputation that it has abroad becomes material and becomes true at home? That is our responsibility as Ghanaians. We then hold a responsibility ensuring that the government is a government of our making, that our politics is a politics of our making, that our view and what we are considered to be democratic and what democracy should mean for us is something that we define the contours and the limits of. That process cannot stop. There's never a point where we can say that the work is done. It must continue in earnest, and it must make sure that it reflects the struggles and the work of activists reflect the struggles of every society there and then. That is the call to duty and action that we have as people generally, I think.
I will call that in the course of the people, let the struggle continues. I want to ask you, do you think advocates across the various regions in West Africa or in Africa can collaborate their efforts together to streamline their efforts together to be able to hold their governments accountable, especially if there's one event happening in Ghana and you also see other leadership or other advocacy organizations in various countries in solidarity supporting that same movement in Ghana. If there's event happening in Nigeria, Ghanaians will do the same thing. Do you think African advocacy or West African advocates organization can be able to achieve this?
Listen, sometime in I think in 1955, there's a conference held in Accra called the Accra Conference that brought so many Pan African leaders on the continent to Accra, and through that they were able to create a coordinated political liberation struggle. The continent is in dire need of a second independence. It's in dire need for for our countries to be liberated from the hold of misgoverning political elites. And we must create a new generation of freedom fighters and persons who are willing to free our countries and from the stranglehold that it's been held. And that process must repeat the independence struggle of the years old. We must create solidarity and avenues to collaborate in different countries across. So it's particularly refreshing to me. And I think that sometimes it might happen in organic ways, and sometimes we must purposely create it. For instance, I believe that Face the Country would not exist today if NSAS had not happened in the way in which it happened in Nigeria and showed the young Ghanaian about the potential of using the internet to mobilize. In the same way, I know, for instance, in Liberia and the Liberian universities, that some had formed Face the Country as well. That the contagion of ideas for change must continue among young Africans. That we must continue to push together in order to achieve social justice. And that process must be both organic and inorganic. Organic in the sense that we must be influenced by ideas, we must open ourselves to ideas from other countries and be influenced by them. But be influenced by the courage of other Africans, young Africans in other countries, from Mozambique to Cairo. But we must also not only leave it to the organic process, but we must actively look out for comrades in these spaces and be able to solidarize and create community with them, that we share our struggles together, that we're able to create networks of reinforcing our energies and creating avenues for which we can succeed together. So that must happen. It must happen for us to be able to move forward. And I think it is happening. The question is more about the pace at which it is happening and how we can quickly ensure that liberation of true freedom comes quickly.
Oh, thank you very much. It's really an interactive discussion, and we are almost coming to an end of the show. But however, I have two more questions before I can take a leave of you. The other question has to do with: did you support the recent government? Did you campaign for them? Did you support them? And if you did, why?
Um, n- I mean, for me, my activism is not for sale. Yeah. That I have to be compelled by a particular mandate or whatever before I'm concerned about canvassing for votes for anybody. I believe that in terms of what my place in Ghanaian society is, it's not a place to canvass for votes for anybody. It's not a place to support anybody. The ordinary politics can continue while we continue to build a movement of that holds the political class accountable. And that can happen, and the people organically would respond to our messaging without us encouraging them to vote for any person. And so that's not our place. That's not been what I view to be what my life's work is in Ghana. And I didn't get into that, and I don't see myself getting into it for the time being.
Thank you very much. I think this will be the last question for us. Looking ahead or looking back to our discussion as well, are there some of the things, or is there anything that you wanted or you thought I would have asked, I did not ask, or is there something that you thought the discussion would have gone to and it didn't go there? If there's anything in your mind in such regard, you can talk about that. Besides that, how do you see the future of Ghana, and where do you think the future of Ghana is now?
In terms of the conversation itself, I mean, I think that every conversation is unique, allows you to be able to explore thoughts differently, or maybe to rethink certain things even as you're speaking. And I think that that's what this has been useful in testing and even thinking through things more, and why we do certain things that we do. So I thank you for that. My thoughts on Ghana and what the way forward looks like. Listen, I've always said that I don't know what tomorrow holds. I know that I'm committed to a struggle to improve the livelihood of the everyday Ghanaian. And every day I wake up in the belief or in the expectation or in the demand that I have life and I have health. That many more people wake up to the urgency of reform and an urgency of doing justice by our people. I hope that the society continues on a trajectory that improves. I know in reality and history has taught us that countries can retrogress. Life moves in circles and not always in a linear manner. My prayer is that whatever way in which the future evolves, it bends closer to justice for the everyday Ghanaian. It bends closer to a different reality. It bends closer to holding political officers accountable. That is the work I am committed to doing for the next few years, and I do hope that others are able to find the way to believing in the urgency of that project and to join us as well. At the end of the day, our hope is for a society that is treated fairly, that lives in dignity. And that, for me, is what is important.
Life is not dynamic. Society can retrogress. Nothing is stable. That those are the final words of Mr. Osajifo on today's edition of Unpopular Opinion. On this note, we'd like to extend our sincere thanks and appreciation to you for taking some time out to be here. We are really grateful that this conversation happened, and we're looking forward to having more of this conversation with you in the future. But before we take a leave of you, I'd like to encourage each and every one of you that are listening to us to please be a supporter of this podcast by liking, commenting, sharing, recommending individuals to us that are doing remarkable works in their various countries in youth development, economic participation, political participation. We will try our best to bring them to this platform to discuss the critical roles that they are playing in their various countries. Today's video is proudly sponsored by Magnite Clothing Brand. If you are living in Europe or in any parts of the world and you need an African clothing, you can simply check them up on their Instagram page. The link is in the description of this video. Mr. Osajifo, thank you very much for being here today. It's been an absolute honor to have you.
Thank you. I appreciate being here as well.